SLU International Business Now, Conversations That Matter is a podcast developed by the Boeing Institute of International Business in St. Louis University's Chaffetz School of Business. Special thanks to founder Dr. Sung Kim for his grant to support the launch of this podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of SLU International Business Now. My name is Matthew Wilcox, and I'm a senior currently studying international business here at St. Louis University. Today, I've got the pleasure of hosting an episode in which we're going to interview two people with in-depth knowledge and experience of franchising and Middle Eastern business about ongoing boycotts in the Middle East. In response to Israel's unprecedented siege on Gaza, the pro-Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, known as BDS, picked up steam all over the world and especially in the Middle East. BDS boycotts have already led to various responses. The grocery store Carrefour pulled out of Jordan recently, for example, and McDonald's has been facing a boycott there ever since one of its franchisees overseeing 225 restaurants in Israel offered free meals to the Israeli military. We're going to be discussing political and ethical dilemmas that arise from franchises in politically sensitive regions abroad. Our guests today are Peter Smith, the Vice President of Global Franchising for Enterprise Mobility, and Dr. Mamoun Benmamoun, a professor here at SLU. Peter, as the Vice President of Global Franchising for Enterprise Mobility, the parent company of Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Alamo Rent-A-Car, among others, will be able to offer us a crucial real-world viewpoint that business students might not fully understand in the classroom on the way in which the franchising business model is affected by volatile political climates abroad. Dr. Benmamoun is an expert in multiple business topics, such as the ways in which the geopolitical climate affects business and Middle Eastern business specifically. He's written extensively on today's topic, including a paper titled McDonald's in the Middle East, Navigating Political and Ethical Minefields, whose objective, he said, was to prepare students to face the challenges of foreign markets. I've already heard them conversing about this exact topic a few weeks ago, and I know that our listeners are in for a deeply insightful and entertaining experience. Our first question is going to be for Peter. Peter, could you describe some of the key legal and managerial challenges that arise when franchising internationally, especially in a politically sensitive area like the Middle East?
Sure, Matthew, and thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We're glad you're here.
Let me start with the fact that while there are legal and managerial challenges when operating a franchise system internationally, often those challenges, while different, are not as significant as in the U.S. Because while there are some countries, a minority, that have the kind of regulatory framework that we have here, most countries do not, and they don't treat franchises as a distinct animal, but rather generically as a form of business. Having said that, of course, there are differences. Recognizing my role here with the learned professor, I'm not going to take too much time, but I'm just going to quickly recite some examples in order to inform and fire the imaginations of your viewers, right? So, for example, first, when we're carrying a phone book size franchise agreement around the world, because increasingly, documents are quite voluminous in the US. Oftentimes there's a cultural challenge there because that's not the case all over the world. An example that I could cite is in an Eastern European country. We were negotiating with an entrepreneur who founded a car rental company in the early 90s. He was not only therefore on the vanguard of car rental, but he was a pioneer in capitalism, right? So when we met him about 20 years later, and we presented our large franchise agreement, which if you accept it at face value at first blush without negotiation, feels like a very domineering document by a very intrusive, overbearing party, you could see viscerally that he felt like he'd spent the first third of his life in a totalitarian environment, the second third liberated, and he wasn't about to go back and voluntarily submit. And so we had to work around that. Some other examples, just culturally, for example, we had a relationship where our Saudi franchisee in the Middle East who had a sub-franchisee in Qatar. A few years ago, many of the countries in the Gulf joined forces in an embargo of Qatar. And so suddenly there could be no commercial communication between the master franchisee and the sub-franchisor, despite the responsibilities that they had to each other. That was something that we worked through by shuttle diplomacy between conference rooms. One more would be Russia invades Ukraine, and there's a visceral reaction in the West, and large brands became very concerned due to public relations about being visible in Russia. And we learned about our own actions there when our Armenian franchisee, who relies on Russia for a lot of business as a source, called up and said, "Where are all my customers? This feels like a second pandemic." Right. And so it turned out that our brands had been eliminated from the online travel agencies, so Russia's version of booking.com or Travelocity. And that was something we needed to work through. On the other side of Ukraine, we were receiving complaints on social media from aid organizations because the vans we were renting in Poland and Romania had, under normal circumstances, a contractual barrier to crossing the border into Ukraine for insurance purposes. Of course, no insurance company is covering something in a war zone, but there wasn't any room for that in the social media, right? So we had to work through that. A final one would be, led by the poster child Argentina. Some countries have capital controls, and they might be there in the beginning of a relationship and they might not, right? And that could bear on a franchisee's ability to export hard currency, US dollars, into our system, which of course that's the fundamental, grease that allows transactions and interactions between parties. So those are a few of the hundreds, and I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. We can get into our next question, which is for Ben. Based on your research and your case study that you wrote about McDonald's in the Middle East, what do you think are some effective strategies that companies can use to manage political and ethical challenges overseas?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. I will just build on what Peter mentioned earlier. Already mentioned some practical actions that corporations in general should take, not just franchise. And the first one I will start with is you have to develop capabilities. For example, you have a Pete who has a lot of international experience. That's one of the capabilities you should have. You should have a team that is knowledgeable about the markets where you are investing, and also not just the markets, but also the implication beyond that market. For example, when you invest in Israel, for instance, or you invest in Lebanon, it's not just about Israel and Lebanon. You should see beyond those. And this is exactly what McDonald's experienced. Yes, the conflict is in the Middle East, but there is a pan-Arab, there is a pan-Muslim, audience that have sympathized with the causes of the Middle East. You should look beyond. There are even people in the US who are boycotting Israeli products, who are boycotting companies that do business with Israel, and vice versa, by the way, and vice versa. In the case of Starbucks, they were boycotted by pro-Israel consumer base, and they were boycotted by pro-Palestinian consumer base. Why? Because they have internal conflicts between the union and the franchise. Number two, corporate social responsibility, which means you need to stand up to what is ethical, what is moral as well. Let me give you another example here. Lafarge, it's a French company, a cement company. They went to Syria. They did some deal with with ISIS. Well, imagine what reaction they're going to receive because of that. So they were first of all sanctioned by the French courts and then sanctioned by the US. They paid a huge penalty. Regardless of what your intention, you already get yourself engaged in a business that will have some negative ramification for years to come. Just to associate yourself with ISIS is a bad business, regardless of your intention. So this is something to keep in mind. That's why you should take an ethical and the moral responsibility, not just for geopolitics, for any issue, an earthquake or whatever. I remember going to the Middle East, and there are some corporations that still have very good reputation in those countries because they help with an earthquake. They help with something natural. And then in the political issues, they will balance on their opinions. The last one is communication. This is an extremely polarized conflict. I already mentioned the case of Starbucks. There are pro-Palestinians and there are pro-Israelis.
Thank you very much. Very great perspective and a lot of great points. Thank you. I was wondering, Pete, if you have anything to add to that from your personal experience.
I agree with a number of points that the professor made. At the most generalized level, what I heard him say was when a corporation is approaching a foreign matter, meaning not occurring in their home country of origin, it's very important to know what you don't know and to have empathy, to be in others' shoes. I've often said, and it seems obvious, that copy and pasting from the United States is a globalization killing mentality. The important thing, rather, is to take what you do best, your own comparative advantages, and export them around the world, but with a sensitivity to differences in culture, in politics, in economics, in law. Often those differences are just around the margins. The world is a relatively small place in business now, I think, due to globalization. But another thing to recognize is you cannot serve all masters. And ultimately, you've got to decide in advance, as the professor notes, what do we stand for, right? Because if we try to be something different based on the political winds, in every market where something happens, which is nearly every day if you're a global company, invariably you'll take positions that are inconsistent or sometimes irreconcilable. And depending on the historical or institutional knowledge of your company, you may not even be aware at the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. I'm glad that you guys both are here to talk about this. My next question is going to be for both of you. In situations where local franchises take a side in a political conflict, how should the parent company respond to protect its brand while also respecting the local and global sentiments of the issue?
I mean, the first things, you need to have a unified statement. McDonald's made a big mistake, in my point of view, where they have multiple statements. One, that's when I say statement, it's not necessarily a verbal statement. It's also actions. And then the headquarters was asked to make a statement. They found themselves in a huge dilemma here because they have their own franchises are taking different position, and it's backlash. So you need to have the unified statement that reaffirm that the brands stand, for example, for the principle that we are non-partisan. McDonald's should have stepped in quickly and make sure, hey, send a memo. Please do not take any action or statements until we come up with a unified statement. They didn't. They paid the price. And they are not the only one. Also, you need to set guidelines. What is the guideline? What are the rules? And also, you need to address the franchise directly. You need to contact them and communicate with them and see where they stand.
Thank you. That's a great point. And what you've been talking about like, having a long-term plan, not seeing things in the short term. We've brought that up in a lot of your classes that I've been in before as well. And I've noticed here at the business school, students will often point to like ethical mistakes or whatever that companies have made years and years before. So that's a really great perspective. Pete, based on your experience dealing with these things in real life, what would you add?
What I'd add is, I think as a factual matter, the first item of business is to identify what the addressable market is for a given corporation. So as a hypothetical, if I only operated in the UK and Greece, right, those are less moving parts, right? And I'd have preparation, for example, about how to deal with Greece's historical asset, the Elgin marbles that are in the British Museum. That's controversial. Or not to pick on Greece, but if I only operated in Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, and my Greek Cypriot franchisee in Cyprus wanted to expand into the autonomous or semi-autonomous self-declared north of Cyprus, which looks to Turkey, I could be prepared for that. But it would be important for me to understand and the company to understand we can't solve it, okay? We can prepare for it, but we shouldn't try to solve it. And in US terms, I would say, don't risk a strikeout going for a home run, a disaster going for a solution. Hit a double, something reasonable. Now, turning to a global company, If you're in 100 countries, then what you find is, I'd say analogously to U.S. foreign policy, okay? If you don't decide first what you stand for, and each subsequent decision is a pragmatic one based on the facts and circumstances, which, by the way, come at us in increasing velocity these days with social media, right? We will trip over ourselves, right? We will, in a South American country, for example, support the removal of a democratically elected president in favor of a dictator. And then the next day, we'll look in a different country, to help support an insurrectionist or revolutionary movement among those we call freedom fighters against a dictator. And at the end, the world just sees hypocrisy. Well, are we hypocritical? I don't think so. This is very, very difficult. Now, I've often said as a baseline, we don't have foreign policy. We rent cars, right? Now, the world at times demands more from you than that. But if we remember that on one hand, and we remember on the other hand, we cannot solve the underlying problem. And if we try to appease everyone, we'll appease no one and appear to stand for nothing. Those are the principles that I would follow. I mean, where the rubber meets the road is in particular examples, of course, and the professor did a great job of surveying some of those.
I will add with you something else, which is training. You need to provide training on brand protection, conflict resolution, and also you need to empower your franchisees, with tool to navigate, for example, customer inquiries, or, for example, challenges that might arise from their local governments. And those are many. You need to have the seat at the table. You need to be engaged. You need to be careful. You need to be neutral. But at the same time, you should not be oblivious what the environment is throwing at you. And also, you need to have a plan B. You should always develop contingency plan for potential boycott, protest, or some kind of PR crisis.
Thank you very much. Our last question is going to be mainly for Pete, but of course, Ben, you can add anything that you find relevant. Pete, from your experience, how important do you think it is for an international franchise to adapt its business practices to align with local cultures and political climates? And can you provide an example of where this was successful or where it was challenging? Just anything that stood out to you?
Let me take it from a commercial point of view, right? Here at Enterprise, our aim is to be the world's best and most trusted mobility company, okay? So what does mobility mean? Well, there are different use cases in different countries, right? Rent-a-car, one of our divisions, our largest, has a different meaning in some countries than in others. So, of course, in the US, we're able to focus a large segment of our business serving US customers that fly to other US cities and rent cars on a short-term basis at airports. Fine. If we sought to copy and paste that to Vietnam, we would have a losing business. Why? Because the market for short-term car rental does not behave that way for inbound customers who land at airports. Ho Chi Minh City is a megalopolis, right? Nobody else in the world shares a language with that country. So it's hard to communicate. It's hard to read road signs. There's a lot of traffic. And you could spend your whole business trip or a holiday trying to find a parking space. On the other hand, labor is relatively less expensive in the form of chauffeured vehicles. And so car and driver business in that market is more important. So much so that many of our corporate clients in the market are South Korean or Japanese manufacturers who may be 20 years ago or 10 years ago or even 5 manufactured almost exclusively in China, but no longer do and are looking to diversify. Why? The standard reasons. 1, political risk, and 2, in the arc of China's development, its labor isn't low cost, particularly on the East Coast. the way it once was. A hallmark of a South Korean or Japanese manufacturing company is they're going to send executives on the ground to manage and oversee production in a foreign market like Vietnam. So what do the customers request from us? Cars for 3 years with a driver in order to align with the international assignments of the home office executives. These are examples of things that we really need to understand. One more quickly. Electric cars are, of course, an item that is dominant now in the popular press and in our industry press, right? There's a place for electric cars in every market. But let me even cite the market that probably has the most penetration for electric cars in the world, Norway, where about 7 out of 10 new cars are electric vehicles. Why? It's a very wealthy country, and it has a small population, and it's very progressive, we can say, politically. Plus, ironically, they have a lot of petrodollars from their oil industry that they can then shift over to subsidize the electric vehicle market. But even still, at the Oslo airport, the capital city airport, we can't have a high proportion of electric cars. Why? Because people who are local are comfortable in electric cars. They know where to charge them, right? And where to go and how not to get lost. But if you're landing there, even if it's from another country with a comparable view of electric cars, another Scandinavian country, people are uncomfortable with electric vehicles in geographic areas that they don't know, right? So these things are cultural. Some of them are practical or common sense. There's lots of examples all over the world, but those are two, and in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. I've really appreciated the insight that you've been able to provide from various perspectives. This last question in particular, I think that we were able to get a perspective from the real world that we don't normally get in business. So I'm really grateful that you were able to join us, Peter. And to our listeners, we hope that you've enjoyed hearing from two experts in the field of international business. If you learned something new, please leave a review with your podcast provider, and we appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in to the SLU International Business Now Conversations That Matter podcast. We invite you to subscribe to this podcast series so you don't miss any future episodes. To learn more about the Executive Master of International Business program, please visit biib.slu.edu. Again, that's biib.slu.edu.